So, Roman, I really appreciate you joining me. So, thanks so much for jumping on here.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
So, first things first, how have you been doing?
Doing well, hanging in there with everything that's going on. Yeah, but really can't complain. How about you?
Good. Uh, the same. Luckily, with starting up a podcast and everyone being stuck at home, it's given me plenty to do because no one can say that they're busy or they're out somewhere.
Right, right. Well, you're in Chicago, right?
I am, yeah.
And do you leave the house or
I do. I mean, I'll go around my neighborhood to, restaurants, shopping. I mean, honestly, one of the nicest things has been just walking around outside with my wife. I work at home for about 10 hours, 10, 12 hours a day every day. And so the act of just getting outside is so freeing.
yeah. Yeah, same boat.
And so, I mean, how has COVID and the shutdown of so many film productions affected your work?
Well, I mean, I hate to say I'm lucky, but I mean, I guess I am lucky for if anything, just because I'm on the post-production side of things. So, I know a lot of people that are in production, on regular crew, and they're really dealing with it a lot more than I am. So I'm lucky to be in the post-production space. If a film I imagine it would be a problem further down the line for me. But luckily, there was enough in the pipeline, and things that were very close to post production got pushed through because people realized that they were going to have delays, and it was just time to wrap it up essentially. So it hasn't affected me too much in that regard. But I also run a recording studio, and people. I mean, we had to shut down for 2 or 3 months fully because you can't have people inside. But the good thing is, a recording studio is essentially a bunch of rooms in isolation. So as it started to open up, we were able to do, and we're still doing it now, small session sizes like 2 or 3 musicians in separate rooms, the engineer in another room. Um, so it's been okay. I mean, music's been evolving to be a little more remote anyway. So we weren't totally unprepared like a lot of other industries. Um, it was just just an unfortunate thing for other reasons.
Right. Yeah, and,
Yeah,
and hopefully as well. I know there were quite a few productions that were stopped mid-production that are picking back up. Right now, I think the Batman started up a week or two ago, and so
sure.
hopefully there's quite a few things like that where, yeah, maybe there'll be a little delay, but there'll be enough that are going to be finishing in the next few months where that stream of work will be hopefully uninterrupted, or at least as much as possible.
Yeah, and I mean there was a lot of creative solutions. So I got pitched a lot of animated
Hmm.
films and television, but then also there was a lot of remote production in that, like, directors were using remote software to direct. I don't really understand it as well, but like, all of my friends on social media are either directors or editors or other musicians, and they would be posting about like their first time doing a remote directing, and you'd have to ask them how that works. But I'm guessing it's somewhere similar to where I'm doing a recording session with someone in LA, and we're doing it all via call-in with video. So I think there was creative solutions, and I'm really excited to see how that influences everything going forward. Um, but in my experience, things just didn't shut down, which is really great.
Yeah,
Um,
that is great.
yeah, I'm sure in the larger scale productions where like you're building a village to do it. Um, Also, I work with a lot of reality TV stars doing songs for them, and some of those things were in production, and they all had bubbles.
Hmm.
Like, they literally, the people there would go, and for 2 weeks they would stay in their bubble, and then they would start doing production with people who hadn't left. And I know there was a few compounds that were doing that.
It's funny you say that because my wife's from England, so we watch this baking show, the Great British Bake Off, or the Great British Baking Show, as it's called in the U.S. And we started watching that the new episode, the first episode of the season, a couple nights ago, and that's exactly what they did, where they took all the judges, all the contestants, everyone, and put them in a village too. So that's actually a good point, and it seems like you're positioned really uniquely that you can actually take advantage of that where not everyone else can.
Yeah, that's why I said I hesitate to say I was lucky, because COVID was difficult for other reasons. But as far as a work standpoint, it could have been worse, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I
Yeah.
noticed you have a few short films at least that are in the either in the post production or in the forthcoming uh, space. Can you tell me a little about any of those?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, oh, so there are a lot of them. I mean, that's kind of, I love doing those. They're not really the kinds of things that pay the bills, so to speak. It's usually, the bigger movies and the TV and the songs that I do for artists that pay, and mostly commercials. But it gives you the freedom to work with really talented people on these shorter projects, and sometimes they turn into great relationships. Sometimes you already have a great relationship, and it turns into like a pitch for a larger project. So I just finished up one, and this was really cool. This is very COVID times, where it was a film in Bangkok. It's called Redemption, and it just came out yesterday. You guys could look it up. And the soundtrack just released as well. But it's a big action film, and there's a lot of like. There actually, one of the guys he's like a big Dutch action star, Ron Smorgan. Smorenberg. I'm gonna ruin his name, and I apologize if he ever sees this. But he was like in a few Jackie Chan movies. Always plays like the final boss kind of guy, in those movies. But anyway, they did this whole thing in Bangkok because the provisions were a little different, slash things were staggered. Every country
Hmm.
got hit differently, right? So they finished shooting before they had to close up, or before they had a second wave, whatever the situation might have been there. And so that was a completely remote job. I've never met any of those individuals except the DP who I did other jobs with. And then he moved to Thailand because they do a lot of films in Asia for these like direct to video platforms, where they're doing like mid-budget
Hmm.
films, but with like really talented crew and post-production. So that was cool. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of other shorts. Some were shot in New York right before they closed. But again, it was nothing out of the ordinary because I'm on the post side and I get the film usually when it's done, or close to done at least. There's usually a few revisions I get here and there from the editors. But yeah, short films never slowed down really. I know they may have had the luxury, like I was saying earlier, that their crews aren't as big. So
Right.
they're like kind of set up to have a smaller budget anyway. So this kind of thing, they're the creative uh, budgeters. I guess everybody in the film industry is really, but yeah, short films kept going.
Interesting. Because yeah, I haven't. I have recently taken much greater interest in short films. It's something that I did a ton of as a kid, and I think it kind of fostered my interest in film, and I think that's the case for a lot of people. So it's really nice to hear that they almost didn't stop, and as you described it, it does make a lot of sense because if you have one actor, two, three actors, it's much easier to get it all going. So that's great to hear.
Yeah, and I also think there has been a huge demand for content while we were all locked down. So people who were going to make something really rushed to do it because they thought maybe they could get distribution deals for these things.
Mm,
Um, so I don't know how that's played out yet. And I feel like if there's a real economic repercussion from this that is even worse than it has been, that maybe those short film productions will slow down because a lot of these things are self-funded, and that's why That's why they're short usually. It's not usually because people don't have a full story to tell. It's because they can only afford to do 15, 20 minutes. Um, and since they're self-funding it, I'm a bit concerned that when the economy feels the full brunt of this, that maybe some of those shorts won't be there. But I could be wrong. It could be the other way around, where these shorts are now being funded because people are desiring the content. So kind of remains to be seen.
And that's, you know, the having kind of external funders is something that I have been, you know, screaming from the mountaintops about for short film because, you know, like you saw, you know, with Quibi that launched, I don't know, 5 6 months ago, where its whole premise was this short content, and you know, I just keep wondering, there are so many people who have short film ideas and want to make it and have the means to make it that, you know, if you even if you spend $1 million, which from Netflix is virtually nothing, that's so much short film content you could make. So that's, if things contract further, that's really my hope because, you know, it's such a easy to consume form of film that, you know, would be perfect on all those platforms.
Yeah, there were a few others before Quibi, you know, they weren't really, there was this, so that film I was talking about in Bangkok, the DP I knew did this platform, or he did some shows for this platform called Black Pills. And I don't really, I'm not qualified to speak on how they did or, you know, the platform,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm not entirely sure they're around anymore, but this, it was that concept to have these short films, but um, when Quibi did it, like it's been really mixed reviews as to how it is, and I still get like ads coming up all the time for their service, even though like there was a big backlash from creators against them because of
Oh.
like royalties and you know, the contracts that were being offered for that kind of content. But what I kind of find in my personal work is that short films are really, really great, but people desire in shorter formats like and again, this is my experience, um, the addiction to the narrative.
Mm.
So if you have like a 10-minute short and it was awesome, you want it to continue. Like you want that world to keep going. So I really love serial stuff, you know, even if it's very short. Like I remember on Netflix, there's that show Bruno. I don't know if you've ever saw that.
No.
Uh, and they're like bite-sized, you know, but they're essentially, it was a series. It did very well. But you know, having a short film approach to serial stuff is really cool as well. Um, and I'm excited to see where that goes because I think there'll be a lot of that stuff coming out. Hopefully, though, it is very well funded because it's hard for people to make this stuff, and sometimes people see, you know, short films as like a hobby, or it's not taken as seriously, you know.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, if you're saying you've really been screaming from the mountaintops, it's because not everybody thinks the same about it.
Yeah, which I don't know, as a an outside observer who has obviously, you know, no ability to change that, it's always frustrating. But, you know, look, at the end of the day, it so much of this is kind of audience and demand driven. So yeah, you're right. If people don't want 5 10 15 minute standalone pieces, you know, that's the market talking. So, you know, maybe I'm just in the minority for my tastes, but you know, who knows?
Well,
I wouldn't be surprised.
yeah, maybe. I mean, they tend to be very high quality, you know, because a lot of times, at least again in my experience, it's people putting together teams of really high-end professionals who are doing it either as like a real builder,
Mm.
or they think that somebody on the project will be able to get it developed further. You know, those are the real ones that you want to chase as a creative. Is like I've done a few for this director Angelo White, and he's done like all these big major feature films as a VFX artist, and then to get into directing, he started doing shorts, and his shorts are wild. Like they're some of the best things in my reel, and they were like 5-minute pieces. But since he was a VFX artist on like Planet of the Apes or Judge Dredd, just like big blockbusters, his shorts just look, they look like $1 million, but they're only 3 or 4 minutes, and the reason we did those was uh, to get them developed. So he's still working on getting some of those picked up, and that's the goal with these things, and that's a lot of times why they're very, very good.
Interesting. And that actually makes a lot of sense because if I'm remembering right, I think the guy that was brought on to do the Evil Dead remake from a few years ago, he originally had only done like I think it was like a 10-minute kind of animated short that was just super high quality, and like that was enough to draw some attention. And like I think directors in animation kind of get a short stick because people don't really appreciate that you still have to do all the directing work. But
Sure.
people appreciated that, and Sam Raimi brought him on to do it. There's a chance that I'm completely mixing two people up, but
You could
that's a
be.
problem with memory.
Yeah, I don't recall either. But yeah, I mean, it proves where there's a will, there's a way. If you put out high quality work, it doesn't have to be 90 minutes of it to show what you're capable of.
No, absolutely. Which that's why it's so cool looking at if you go to a lot of big directors or actors or DPs or composers or anyone to their IMDb's. So many of them, their first few years are just littered with short films because it's a great launching pad.
Sure.
But to veer away from talking about short films a bit, you just had a feature release on HBO Max, Huracán. Uh, how did that come about?
Um, so it was kind of an organic thing, kind of like how I met you on social media. So I knew the director from social media. We liked each other's work. He had seen other things that I had scored, and I had seen his previous work. And we were friends online for a while. I don't even we tried to figure it out after this thing was successful. Um, and I don't know, just like maybe I liked his post, and then he followed me, and whatever it was. Um, and essentially, we had been following each other for a long time. And when he said that he was working on a feature, I told him, of course, I'd love to score it. And so I scored some of the original camera tests that they were doing. And then he sent me the script, and that was it. And I was locked in pretty early on, which was unusual. A lot of times I get brought on at the very end, especially for people I haven't worked with before. Um, like, again, a lot of films that I've done, I knew the director from doing a short or something. Um, and then a lot of feature films that I've done in the past, I got brought on at the very end when they realized they needed a composer. Um, sometimes it's like you spend years doing the film, and then in the last few weeks, you're like, uh-oh, I need to actually make sure somebody scores this instead of using like library music or, um, having my buddy score it.
Right.
It's like we need somebody who's doing this. So with Huracán, Cassius and I just knew each other, and we uh, liked each other's aesthetic. So he brought me on very early on, and then after we scored the film, I mean, we just got really lucky that it was a good enough film that HBO wanted to pick it up. So I think actually even as you and I are still speaking, it's still actually on HBO. So not just on HBO Max, like you can watch
Oh,
it on um, HBO on demand or HBO Latino, which like I think if you have HBO, you have HBO Latino as well, like the actual television channel.
hmm,
Um, so you could still watch it there or on demand, or I think for the foreseeable future, it'll be on HBO Max.
very cool. And so, having been brought on very early, what was your approach to scoring it then?
Oh, so I mean, that's always the hardest question because my answer generally is it's not my approach. It's really kind of the director's music, more than kind of. It's the director's music. I'm just helping them find it. So my approach was to write some music uh, to get to elicit a response from the director. Um, so we had preliminary conversations about, what's the aesthetic of this film? Are we going dark? Which we were. and then trying to figure out the instrumentation that would resonate with the director. And what we did was we scored the overture. So essentially, the opening scene, which used to have this quote over it, a Nietzsche quote, and was like just literally a minute of black screen, because he thought it would be crazy if people, like, that's not something you see generally. A film starts with
Right.
just black and the music. The reason that he scrapped that idea, I believe, was because he wanted eventually to get this picked up by a streaming service. And I think like Netflix or HBO, if the end user, like a viewer, turns on the TV and it's just black, they might think there was an issue. So that's why we scrapped that idea. But what it did was it allowed me to really focus on what is the heart sonically of this film. And it was really hard to figure that out. In fact, normally the first thing I write is not the opening of the movie, because it doesn't become clear until later in the film what that will be, what your palette should be. But on this one, we really wanted to discover that stuff. So my approach to it was to best understand what he wanted for the film. And what it turned out was that he wanted to go a hybrid, so between orchestral instruments and electronic instruments. And the film is about an MMA fighter who has a dissociative identity disorder. So the film needed to have, sonically, again, in the score, it needed to have an identity disorder. So there was a few ways I thought of approaching that. One was going to be this very disjunct, glitchy kind of thing.
Mm.
So to do it that way, but that didn't seem right to it. And it also would kind of put you in a very weird pigeonhole where it's very hard to progress when things are glitched out and disjointed like that. So what we did was to have two disparate sides of the orchestration. Like I said, the electronic instruments and the acoustic instruments. And sometimes they morph into one another. Sometimes they exist on their own. And oftentimes they are serving two purposes, which is to carry the narrative along, but also to help color the subtext of the film. And it's the interaction of those two parts of the instrumentation, as well as the the exact content that they're performing, the musical content, that gives meaning to the film through music.
And I think, if you watch the film, that kind of a dual approach becomes really apparent, especially in certain I don't want to say like kind of motif scenes, but you see there are multiple sequences in the film where the Alonso he's in the ring, and everything is quite normal, and then there's like this the switch that gets flipped, and Huracán comes out, and there's a kind of visual aspect to it, but then there's this kind of really jarring in a good way musical cue almost that comes in that signals it too, and then the music completely changes. So I thought that was an interesting approach that personally I thought worked quite well.
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, I really wish I could take credit for it, but again, it's, I'm just an instrument. I know how to play the music and to write it. But a lot of those concepts were coming from, the conversations the director and I were having. And I was really happy for that. I mean, sometimes, films are done so quickly that it's really a matter of making sure it's working and it's helping the story, as opposed to, in this, we had a long time to
Mm.
find the true sound of it. And we tried a lot of stuff, and some of it worked better, and this is what we landed on. And it was kind of one of those things where, like, at the end of the film, we were like, oh, if only we knew this when we went into it, it would have been a much quicker process. But we left no stone unturned.
And luckily you had the time to kind of spend that time to figure everything out, because who knows, if you had 4 weeks to score the whole thing, it wouldn't have turned out as well as it did. So there might be a downside that it took a long time, but there's the silver lining that you had the time and it turned out well.
Yeah, no, I was very happy that I was given the opportunity to A, come on so early, but then B, that this project, it was unlike something that is funded by a studio, um, because this essentially was an indie film that was picked up by a major distributor. So there's a lot of luxuries there that you don't get, and that's why indie films are really great a lot of the time. I mean, big studio films sometimes have this luxury, sure, and people are at such a high level that this artistry can come through anyway. But the director Cassius wasn't going to. There was no deadline. The deadline was when it's right, when it's artistically where he wanted it to be. So as frustrating as it could be to work on something for so long and never knowing what your deadline is, it was also incredibly rewarding that you met the deadline, which was it's perfect, or at least perfect to what he was going for.
Right. In which, at the end of the day, for a film, if it's perfect for the director, it's perfect.
Yeah.
But that's interesting. I mean, did you with that time and kind of the lack of a set deadline, did you ever find yourself really just kind of stuck toiling at the same things, figuring out what works? Or I mean, how did that aspect go?
Well, so I mean, it's yeah, a little bit. But I mean, for the most part, I would do a pass of the score and send it to Cassius, and I get revisions, and then I would do them, and we maybe some of them would get checked off, and other ones I didn't quite hit the mark. So there wasn't a whole lot of toiling, except in the very beginning where it was more a matter of just wanting to submit a large amount of ideas. So it wasn't exactly toiling, but it wasn't like, here's one, do you like it? It was more like, here's 15 of them. Tell me which ones you like and dislike and why, and then I can zero in on things, which is a process I really like. And I actually do that on a lot of other projects. Like right now, I'm working on a YouTube original series, and
Hmm.
uh, the deadline is very quick. It's very fast turnaround, um, to the point where like I couldn't even talk about it at first, and now it's like 2 weeks away from airing, kind of thing, or maybe
Jeez.
three. Um, but the same thing happened there, where I did essentially a collection of scores of cues, if you will, and in that case, the production company tells me which ones they like, which ones they don't like, and then we go with a few, and then the network tells me which one they like and which one they don't like, and I have to go through it again. So uh, it's pretty commonplace, I think, for me to have to submit many ideas and then them distilled and torn apart, and then resubmit ideas and distilled and torn apart. Um, and that's just kind of how it goes. So uh, you know, it wasn't too different in that regard.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and I think for I don't know for some people that or maybe some kind of casual film music fans or observers, might think that's a lot of kind of involvement, but it seems to me that that's kind of very much how it goes. It's such a collaborative process that everyone has to be involved, especially the director and if there's external funding, the studio, the distributors, everyone like that. So that's interesting to hear kind of all the passes that even a few kind of almost sample cues can go through before you're really nailing things down, and then that continues again and again.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially the more unique a show is. So with Huracán, that was such a unique concept to have an MMA and a psychological thriller. The implications for the score, it's very unique. And then for the children's show, or the YouTube original I'm doing, it's a children's show. Um, it's such a unique spin on an adult show, but for kids, that you can't just be like, hey, we need nursery rhymes, or we need some action cues. It's like, can you synthesize something that encompasses multiple styles? So that's why there's that kind of review process. And it's what's really cool, I think, about multimedia. You know, if I was just writing music because I like to write music, I probably wouldn't end up like writing an EDM song with a glockenspiel. You know, like it's, it's just um, it's just one of the fun parts about making music for other people.
But it's funny that you mention um, like doing an EDM song because obviously my first kind of experience with your music was listening to Huracán, which a lot of it is very atmospheric, especially some of the actual warmer shots. There's a scene kind of early on where I think he's just kind of riding his bike through this suburb of Miami, and it's a quite warm, gentle sound. And then listening to some of your other music, and I can't remember. You have series soundtrack on Spotify that I was listening to earlier, and that has a lot more almost like pure EDM type songs, and so I was very surprised at hearing those two extremes.
Sure. Well, so I also have a pseudonym. I go by Electro Point, and I use that for. I do a lot of work for reality TV stars, like dance music, pop music. It's the reason I use a pseudonym is because it's very different from the film music that I do, and sometimes in film and television, you do get pigeonholed a little bit, which sometimes works in your favor, sure. So like, I do songs for reality TV stars and their EDM songs or top 40 stuff. Um, and you don't want to confuse a director that you're going to be doing that on, a psychological thriller. Although, there are scenes where I bring some of that stuff into in Huracan. There's like one or two moments of trap music.
Hmm.
And I use, you know, some of the skill sets from that type of music. But the one you're referring to, I did this television series called All Hail Beth, and that was a crazy mishmash of genres too, because we went Iranian orchestral for that because the lead character was a Babylonian princess or goddess, I'm sorry, Babylonian goddess who wakes up in the body of a Brooklyn hipster. So the score is very unique in that sense, but also because there's this Brooklyn hipsterness going on. Some of the scenes in that show are like Bushwick parties, and I'm having to bring in some of the like Bushwick minimalist dance music, like synth-driven throwback stuff. Um, so sometimes it works in my favor, having that second career as a music producer for artists. Um, but again, I generally use the pseudonym because some of the work that I've done in that field isn't the best when it comes to pitching on a film.
Hmm.
But it's becoming more and more okay, actually. More films I'm doing are asking for me to also do, for lack of a better word, popular music as opposed to film scoring stuff. So there's a lot of dance music or hip hop in scores now. And it's awesome because to me, it's all music.
Well, and it makes so much sense, especially kind of any film that's going to be set in a contemporary setting, even if it's just almost like incidental music that's happening diegetically in the background or something, with your ability to create that yourself rather than having to get someone external or go to a library. It to me it seems like it's just an extra set of skills that you're able to pitch that gives you that much more versatility compared to someone who might just be kind of purely classically trained and that's all that they're used to.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I tend to view it that way. It's just, it depends on the way that the director is viewing it, when they're looking for an artist. Sometimes they want somebody who's a specialist in something so that they feel like they're getting the top of the line in that field.
Mm.
Other times they want to have somebody who's versatile. I get it. I totally understand it. Either way. Uh, but I think the way that the industry is moving is that you need to be able to provide all of the audio elements for the film. I mean, even so far as like the company that I run, we do sound design and mixing as well. And I generally don't sound design and mix the same film that I'm scoring. My business partner will do that, or some of our engineers. And likewise, if they're scoring something, I would step in and help, or one of the engineers would, because uh, when you get to audio post-production for a filmmaker, unless they're very experienced, they might not understand how many different departments that requires. Like there's the film score, and then there's the sound designer who takes care of, he's the top, or he or she or they are the top of the chain there. But there'll be a number of people below them dealing with the dialogue and the ADR and the mixing and the 5.1, and just on and onward until all aspects of the audio are taken care of. And I think the younger or less experienced a filmmaker may be, they're not necessarily aware of that, and they expect all of those things. And then likewise, if somebody is very experienced and knows all of that stuff, we're able to offer it as well. But it's kind of moving that way, where you need to wear a few more hats, I think, than just being able to write for an orchestra.
And I mean, that makes a lot of sense, and that is, really echoing what I'm hearing from other composers as well. And I don't know, I think it's an interesting kind of move, because, again, so many people think of like John Williams conducting an orchestra, and that's it.
Yeah.
And there is so much more going on, and especially, just all the actual, audio tracks in a film and mixing it all together. It's I don't know. I find it really fascinating. The getting outside of the film music aspect is getting outside of, what I'm familiar with. But, the more I hear about it, I don't know. I think it's really interesting, and honestly, it just shows kind of how much more complicated the filmmaking process is, and how much more like technical ability there is in virtually every aspect.
Yeah, there's a lot going on for sure. I mean, I feel that same way when you start, like, from where I'm sitting, it always helps me to learn a little bit about the other parts of the process. Like, what is the cinematographer doing? Because that's not something I have a skill set in. And every time I learn it, just your respect for those departments grows immensely because of how technically talented they are, on top of being artistic. Um, yeah, it's a great industry to be in, because you're surrounded by other creative individuals who also have great technical chops.
Yeah. And so I guess on that line, I mean, how often do you actually try to get on set in a production to see what else is going on and kind of get a feel for the kind of in the moment of the film?
Oh, it's barely ever happened. I mean, again, I generally get things at the very end,
Mm.
um, for whatever reason. And there's been a few where I've been lucky enough to get in during the script. And that's amazing. I'm just so grateful when people know that they want me to do it, and to share their script with me is to like really trust me with an exposed part of themselves. So I value that greatly. But even in those instances, I've not really been in. I wouldn't say I've not been invited, but it hasn't necessarily come up that it would be a benefit for me to be there. I've definitely gotten or received like dailies,
Mm.
which are really cool. So like, cut some footage from the day to see what's going on, so I can get a sense of it. Um, but unless they have a very good budget for things, people generally are very respectful of your time, and they'll wait until they have something that represents, um, or warrants your time to view it or to start working to it. Generally, other times, people are friends, and we're working on this artistically, and the consideration of time isn't one of professional or non-professional. It's just, hey, check out what I'm working on, and of course I'd want to see it. Um, been to set maybe once or twice,
Oh, okay.
but it's yeah. I'm not sure I would be much help.
Well, at least you're upfront about that. But yeah, I mean, I've
Yeah,
talked to other people who, and maybe it's not so much from the compositional side of things as it is just the personal interest of wanting to go down there and see, how the sausage is made.
sure. Yeah, no, it's definitely fascinating. And I think the longer I do this, the more sensitive I am to the subtleties of what I'm seeing. Again, just the decisions that they're making, how one director does something differently than another. If I'm scoring the same kind of scene from two different films, I'll be very aware of that. Or particularly if I'm doing something for the same director more than once, uh, I'm very sensitive to their voice or the techniques that they're using, and it would be really cool to see that in action. um, yeah, but I guess it'd probably be even more difficult these days given
Right.
yeah, what's going on with that, but hopefully not for not too much longer.
Well, I think that's everyone's hope. So you got, fingers
Yeah,
crossed on
right.
that.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious because, two of the main projects that you've mentioned, obviously, an MMA psychological thriller and then a kind of children's TV series. Is there any kind of genre that either you've kind of had the most fun doing or that you really want to that you haven't had a chance to do?
Oh wow. That's a big question. I guess I so for me it's less about the genre of the music actually, because I really like that every day is a bit different. And I certainly probably have strengths, but for me it's more about the picture. So I like I said, I like to think of myself as a versatile composer. What got me into film, I studied classical music, but I also did a lot of work in the pop world, and I had a lot of success there, and that allowed me to transition over. Um, but what really got me into being able to do films was I did a lot of commercial work, and I still do that. And although it's becoming less common because they're relying more and more on libraries,
Mm,
because that again, it's not really, for the most part, about artistry. It's about putting out quantity of quality work quickly for the project. And I'm sure some people may disagree with that because I love working with directors for commercials. I really do. Um, but it's just becoming a little less common. Um, but when you do commercial work, the genres are vast, even more so than film. I think
hmm.
one day you're just writing mariachi music, and the next day you're writing trap music, and it's like wildly all over the place. Um, so I tend to think that I'm comfortable in most genres, some more than others. And what I'm not comfortable doing, I generally hire players to help me with it, and but the good thing is most films that I am working on, there is some like thread uh, that ties it together, which is not necessarily in one genre or another. Um, but what I really like working on are just great films. So if it's shot really well, the writing is really good, the director is really good, it's colored really well, then I'm a very excited person about the project. And you could tell me to write some style that I like less than other styles, and I'd be psyched about it because your film is excellent. So that's what really excites me. It's obviously more fun working on fun projects, which is probably the cop out answer, but I'm going to go with it.
And it might be a cop out answer, but I don't know. It's still an honest answer, and look, I think that's gonna hold true for most people in and not just creative professions, but I mean most professions. You're gonna be most excited to work on something that is good and that you're having fun with. So, I'll take that answer.
Thanks.
Interesting. And so I guess, going back to Huracán really quick, one of the things that really struck or stuck out to me was how how well you were able to work with the actual film cinematography, and particularly there are these really kind of anxious claustrophobic moments that the score itself really hammers in. I mean, can you give any insight into how you crafted that?
Sure. So, I mean, it, a lot of times people, when they read about the film or even just saw the trailer, they thought it was going to be one of two things: either an action film, like because of the fighting, so an MMA film, or they thought it was going to be a horror film, because the score is like it's dark at times for sure. But at the end of the day, it's a film. It's a psychological thriller, and it deals with people who have a mental illness, and so it's a very heavy topic. And I had to go to some places in myself that I don't normally go to, um, and one there was two or three main techniques aside from the orchestration that I mentioned to point out the psychology of the individual, the two disparate parts of them. But aside from that musical technique, uh, you know, things like pulsing, just like broadly speaking, so some very low instruments pulsing along, either if it was a synth, just like a bass pulse, something that morphs over time but has a constant rhythm to it. Um, or if it was orchestral, just very slow, repetitious bow strokes, but on lower instruments. That kind of thing gets your heart rate going.
Hmm.
And when it's nestled underneath the rest of the instrumentation, you may not even notice it, but it gets your heart rate going, which I dislike when I'm in a film and my heart starts going. I feel it too much. I'm a little too sensitive to it. So I was aware of how effective that could be as a device. And then there's some jump scares, meaning like all of a sudden you'll get like a big loud noise or something that's very distorted and dirty sounding, that comes out of nowhere, which is why some people thought it was horror. Um, so that really builds in that claustrophobic thing. But the pulsing is a big one. And then also I guess you could call it less pulsing, but more chugging, meaning it was like chuk, 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 that kind of thing happening, and like swelling in. So
Hmm.
sometimes it would be kind of filtered, and the filter would open up so that you would find that the intensity of any of those effects are growing over time slowly. There was almost always one pulse or chugger. There's got to be a better word for it.
I don't. You
I
can
mean,
coin
those,
one.
yeah, chugger. And I sing chug because it really, the way that it was made was in the early scene, he's on the subway. And so on the subway in New York City, I recorded some of those like train sounds. So that like, a train chugs, I guess. There's got to be a better way to phrase it. I'm going to look back on this podcast and go, why did I use that word? But I use that as a way to create motion without using like a drum set or a drum machine, because I wanted it to be more organic, yet still have a bit of suspense going on to it, and a bit of unique color that you wouldn't get otherwise. Also, was kind of organic to the film because the opening shot, you see him first get anxious on a train. Um, so that was just a sound that worked out really well. But it's done in a lot of different ways, using organic instruments as well, like
Hmm.
bowing techniques and things.
And so when you say that you were recording kind of some of the like literal train chugging, was that as almost a reference point, or was that a kind of recording that you manipulated and used in the score itself?
Oh no, it was something I manipulated and used in the score itself. So I programmed a lot of instruments by sampling different sounds. So some of them were actual instruments. So a lot of times, you can't afford to have string players come in over and over again and all of that stuff. So you'll record, a sample of something and program it into an instrument so that you can play it back again, with new content. Um, so I did a lot of that in the very early stages to help discover the sounds of the movie, where I was recording different instruments or different ways of playing instruments, but I was programming them into synthesizers so that when they were approved by Cassius for the film, I was able to then play those things back however I wanted, as opposed to like, uh-oh, now I have to play that again, but with new content. And every time I send the director a cut of the cue, I have to play it live again. So, and also, you know, metaphorically or metaphysically, I wanted to program that stuff into synthesizers anyway, because I was trying to combine synthetic and organic. Um, so, so yeah, and some of that was non-musical or seemingly non-musical sounds, like a train or even an elevator makes a crazy sound that gives you some suspense. But yeah, mechanical sounds are really good at building tension for sure. I don't know what that is. Maybe because they're closer to white noise, and
Mm,
noise is scary. So if you manipulate that stuff, also white noise or mechanical sounds tend to have less of a definite pitch, because again, they're closer to noise. So they'll work in whatever key you're playing in.
interesting.
Um, so you essentially, it's percussion, right? So like, you don't necessarily have to tune all of your percussion to the song always. Um, so yeah, there was a lot of that, and I think that built out the psychological aspect, but it also did point a little bit at some of the horror stuff in the film, even though the only horror for sure was you know that internal struggle, and then maybe one or two scenes which I don't want to give away necessarily, but it certainly wasn't horror in the sense of a horror film.
Right. Right, it's not the Shining or something, but you know
Yeah,
what? I actually that's a bad example because it's like there is this shared psychological horror aspect to it in a lot of ways.
sure.
But yeah, I know what you mean, and I think everyone else will understand it too. But I actually, you said you didn't like that kind of feeling of the like low kind of physical anxiety. I've got to say I love that when I get a physical response from music. I mean, I listen to power electronics sometimes. It's just this like awful, noisy, discordant genre, but it quite often has that really low feel that makes you almost physically sick. And I understand most people don't want that in music, but
Yeah,
when it's combined with film that kind of is meant to elicit some sort of response like that as well. I mean, it's great, and it worked really well. That scene right in the beginning, in particular. I mean, that creates such a good, just uncomfortable atmosphere that I think really sets the tone for the film. And so people that are expecting an action film are going to have that thought kind of just destroyed in about the first 10 seconds.
yeah, that was one of the hardest scenes to do, because it had to set the tone for all of that. um, Also, the camera work is really cool. That is like one of those, again, not to give away the movie, but that's a point of view shot, right? So you're in the character, and I love that scene. I just love the camera work there, and I almost submitted that there should be no music there, because I thought I couldn't do it better. I was just like, don't, but now that I see it, I love what the music that Cassius pushed me to get there ended up being. Um, and at times it almost wasn't music. Like, I wrote a whole bunch of stuff there that was melodic or had strong chord progressions, and then what we went with was this much more textural, atmospheric thing that has moments of distinct musicality, but at first you're like, what is this, is this sound design, is this a but it was strings, and so I'm glad that scene resonated with you, because I really enjoyed that part of the film.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things with a lot of people who like film music. Very much I'd say like the film music purists who really want each film score to have like six distinct melodic themes that are going all the way back from like the Wagnerian school, and there's a pushback from them on that sort of music that you're talking about, but you know I have such an issue with that because at the end of the day, what you're making isn't meant for someone to be listening to on their own, to just enjoy a 50-minute release. First and foremost, it's is this going to enhance the film? And there, like that scene in particular, like you said, you can't have this really melodic piece over top because it I'm sure somebody somewhere could figure out a way to make it work, but I don't. It doesn't work. Whereas
Yeah,
that approach, I mean, that it was great.
thank you. Yeah, no, I was really happy with how that came out. And that's like you're saying, that's not what this film was about. Um, you didn't want to hear my soaring string lines because it wouldn't have allowed you to go deep inside this character. And I love being able to do more melodic things for sure, but uh, um, yeah, I was happy that this film we were playing more with the inner psychology rather than the beauty you could find in the first violins.
No, and I like that, and I think my actual like personal tastes are probably a little different than most people's because I listen to a lot of just really grating extreme music, and my very brief musical career another life ago was in like harsh metal and drone, and so I mean I have a real appreciation for that as standalone music. So when it works well in a film, I mean it offers a very kind of different palette than just kind of traditional melodic orchestral music can give. And so I think it's great, and I'm really happy that it seems like more films and composers are going that direction when it's appropriate.
Yeah, yeah, me too. It's great. There's just such a breadth of creative genres going on right now. I think it's a real renaissance for film music.
And it's so funny you say that because on various forums and online, I see so many people complain that this year's been bad for film music. 2019 was bad for film music. Like what's going on? It's like no, I mean this year has had so many scores that I've liked. Last year did. I mean like last year you listened to like Daniel Lopatin's Uncut Gems or Michael Levy's Manos, and like these are just really weird pieces of music that work really well, and they're not something that you'd have heard 10 years ago. And yeah, they're not your traditional film music, but I mean they work great, and they're just so fascinating. And so yeah, if you want just you know pure thematic stuff, yeah, I mean, maybe you'll be let down, but if you actually appreciate the breadth that's out there and just like the pure musical diversity, oh, you couldn't ask for a better time.
Yeah, and it's not like those scores went away. I think there's just both now, which is like you're saying, it's a wonderful thing. Um, yeah, I mean, people always want what they're used to, for sure. If you really enjoy something and it's going out of style, it's hard to deal with. And I certainly like writing more grandiose, romantic music a lot, but that doesn't mean that I don't want to write other types of music.
No, I mean, and that makes sense. And I think, and maybe I'll be putting your words in your mouth, but I imagine that as a composer with a diverse background, it has to be kind of more exciting to be doing various genres rather than the same thing over and over.
Yeah, absolutely. So I love that all of those things are being considered viable soundtrack choices.
Yeah, and like you said, now you're even getting the chance to start putting more, you know, popular music, trap, EDM, things like that in, which, again, just expands it even more.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, it's those things that that point out we're probably in a renaissance for this. Um, it's all music.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's look, I I have genres that I like more than others, but at the end of the day, I'm I love the diversity of music. I mean, it's great, and so I personally am just stoked that I try to listen to everything that comes out every week for film music, and the diversity on a given Friday when most film scores come out, it's so fun because I never have any idea what I'm going to be listening to.
Yeah, it's awesome. I mean, that's pretty much my whole radio now. Um, it used to be I'd listen to film scores, but then I might need to listen to something else just to get a change. But like you're saying, it's all in there now.
Has you know you mentioning that? Are there any kind of scores or composers that you've really been listening to recently?
Oh wow. So yes, because like I said, that's pretty much all I've been listening to these days. If if there's anybody standing out to me at the moment, it's probably doing a disservice to everybody else I'm listening to, which is probably another cop out for you here. I mean, I really find myself again just because I'm straddling the line between being a producer half the time and being a film composer half the time, looking to people who either in the past or currently are dealing with that. So like for example, Junkie XL's
Mm.
stuff is that's always fascinating to me because there is that combination, or Joe Trapanese, because you're again seeing like having worked with really big recording artists and like the treatment of the Daft Punk stuff, for example, or even some of his more current scores, where you see those different facets of the same individual working across different media. So that stuff I've been really into, but then I've been listening to a whole lot of older scores. Like lately, I don't know what happened to me, but I started going down a John Barry hole. So like talking about classic Hollywood, um, and just and that's somebody who I appreciated for the same reason, because in his time he was a big band individual, but he was also a great soaring string composer, and I found that to be fascinating. Like James Bond's themes, where you have these great drums and horns, but then also like Dances with Wolves, and you have
Mm.
um, just like neo-romantic music that is written by the same individual. And that was at a time where we don't have the technology that we have now for everybody to be as versatile. That was in this person's mind. So that I find that stuff fascinating. But to answer your question, in a broader sense, it's really dependent on the projects that I have coming at the moment. I'm doing this YouTube show, and the references, meaning like, some of the sounds that they like are other children's music, or, Nickelodeon shows or things from days of old. And a lot of times they're composers you've never really heard of, because they were doing kids shows at a time where people didn't cross between film and television. And so they weren't the biggest film scores, but it's fascinating to hear. um, yeah, so it's like dependent on the day, what film scores I'm listening to. And then, I also have that problem of that I'm writing music all day long. So a lot of times afterwards, I am not, am not listening to it. So, so yeah, it's a complicated dance between listening to other music and not wanting to listen to music, but then also craving craving
Right.
it. Yeah, it's a subtle dance.
So and look, you said that was going to be a cop out answer, and it was anything but. So I mean, no, that's awesome to hear, and I do really love hearing the composer's perspective on other composers because while you're approaching it from just an enjoyment of the music aspect, there's that experience and knowledge that your average music fan or film music fan isn't going to know at all. So yeah, so I mean, I think that's really cool. And yeah, you mentioning some of those composers that straddle the world like you do. I think I saw in another interview you did, you mentioned Tyler Bates, and that's someone where like he's done a lot of like really great production work too on for some of Marilyn Manson stuff, and I'm sure a bunch of other people's. And so yeah, I mean, I think it's really great how just diverse that skill set is. I mean, like you said, 30 years ago, you wouldn't have expected a film composer to also be, producing pop music or metal or, anything else in that world.
Yeah, exactly. And again, speaking to that renaissance that we're having or have been having, um, yeah, and I love that stuff, and it just generally sneaks in. So if you listen to film scoring radio, or I don't know how you were consuming it on like Spotify
Mm.
or
Yeah,
um,
yeah, on Spotify.
yeah. So you as soon as you're listening, all of a sudden, some composer who you've heard before, now their score has all of these other different new elements in some other style, but it's been film scorized. Where it's maybe a little more subtle, I guess would probably be the way. Like if you listen to like I think about Black Panther as a good
Mm.
example. The film score, that had a lot of trap in it too, like the hi hats and stuff.
Yeah.
But it didn't always have like booming 808s and like 909 claps and stuff going at the same time. So it would be like a subtler version of things to help it be part of the film score. Um, yeah, I hear that a lot. Like I was watching Birds of Prey the other day, and that Daniel Pemberton score, and like there's also a whole lot of music supervision in that, so that it
Mm.
actually goes to trap music. But then the score has a lot of that kind of stuff going on in it too. Um, yeah, so when you're listening to score radio or actually buying soundtracks, all of a sudden you'll see very subtle versions or sometimes not so subtle versions of these other styles in the scores.
Oh, and it's interesting because Birds of Prey is actually that's a really good example of that because I remember listening to that earlier in the year when it came out, and hearing so many different genres depending on the specific character's theme in particular. And I have notes on it written down somewhere from when I was listening, but I mean like each character's theme is almost embodying kind of a film score version of a specific genre. And I mean that's look, that's it's so cool, and it's so interesting how a composer is able to take a genre and kind of meld it to a character.
Yeah, no, it's a great example. I mean, that film was very visually loud. That it was not the easiest film to maybe pay attention to that stuff in. So it's really cool that's one of those scores that listening to the score really enhanced actually
Mm.
watching the film. Um, Although, that's hyperviolent films are often difficult for people to watch with that kind of sensitivity sometimes, but it's really great that the composer was still able to be very artistic about those subtleties in an otherwise seemingly less subtle film.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know. I always like when there's kind of a juxtaposition like that. Not
Sure.
all the time, but I don't know. I think it does create a little more kind of like subtlety and texture rather than it being all right. Well, there's hyper violence. Well, the music's just going to be loud and it's going to bash your head in too.
Yeah.
Um, but shoot, it looks like we're actually like well over an hour at this point. I think it's about 8:15 on your end, so I won't keep you all night.
All right. Yeah, no problem. I mean, it really was my pleasure.
Well, no, I mean it's all mine. I really appreciate you reaching out to me and then you coming on here, and especially taking your evening to jump on too. You know, it
Sure.
because like I said earlier, it makes things so much easier for me and so much less stressful during the interview because I know that I don't have a whole bunch of stuff waiting for me at the end.
That's great. Yeah, well, same here. So it was a good that our schedule synced up so well.
Yeah, and so yeah, thanks again. Obviously, I'll kind of be in touch afterwards, and I hope you have a great night.
All right, thanks so much, Nick.
All right, take care.
All right, take care.